Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how I finished this desert weathering for the Academy Panzer II model and how you can manage to get realistic results for a desert finish. After creating a nice coat of dust effects, now it's time to move forward. And for the next step, I should be adding more color, because it would be a waste of time to paint the accessories prior to heavy dust effects. Now it's time to take some acrylics. Focusing now on the engine deck, I start base coating all the accessories in a really dark color, a mix of whole red and black to be more precise. I found very interesting to include these aiming poles during the assembly phase. Once painted, they would add some more color variation to the brownish sand colors of the camouflage. Using first an off-white color for the base coat and later some acrylic red and a fine detail brush was my way of approaching this task and getting straight lines. Obviously, it is mandatory to make some initial markings to know where each color is supposed to be placed. The surrounding tarp was painted using green and khaki colors. A really handy color to paint highlights for khaki tarps is sunny skin tone. Here, applying a couple of lighter shades, I established some basic volumes, focusing specifically in the bigger folds. There's been a while since I began using a simple but effective way of representing wooden parts. In my case, I base coat all the wooden pieces using basic skin tone color, and later I apply some thin glazes of raw amber brown color over them. Once you have applied around 3 glazing coats, the effect gets very convincing. In the case of the remaining accessories, I tried to represent some different grades of weathering. Apart from a colorful addition to the model, these captured British fuel cans can be shown as old metal pieces that have been under heavy duty for a long time. Finishing with the small details on the other side, and for representing some contrast among accessories, I decided to represent the German water cans in a better condition, just representing some light weathering on them using a whole red color for creating light chipping. First, I used the sponge method for a general application, and later my detail brush for some deeper chipping around the edges. Now, I took again the whole red color and I mixed it with a bit of black. Although in the last video I represented heavy chipping effects over the entire vehicle, you can click here to watch it. My paint job didn't cover heavier and deeper chipping. In this case, as I plan to represent the exposed armor and metal, I will be using a dark red brownish color. When representing this kind of effects, it is key to study our model and knowing which parts are going to be more exposed to a deeper chipping. Metal boxes, big old hatches, or engine deck plates are the ones suffering more stress or deterioration. I like to use a fine detail brush with a nice pointed tip, but also it is fair to talk about the paint consistency. The finer the brush is, the thinner the paint should be. In my case, I used to work with a 60% paint and 40% water ratio. Prioritizing thicker paint rather than a thinner one will make you to have a solid coverage at once, achieving a more realistic result. The brush chipping approach I use for this model can be easily seen here in these clips from the engine deck hatches, hitting the model from different directions and creating small scratches. Building the chipping effect step by step allows me to control the effect better, and also it makes it easier to get a convincing effect. Keep always in mind that less means more when representing this type of effects. And on the other hand, a nice way of avoiding repetitive effects is to look for asymmetry. These two identical pieces can't be painted in the same way, as they will look artificial. Moving to rust effects, for this model I wanted to save a special place for the rusted pieces. I find rust effects in desert vehicles very interesting, and from a modeling perspective, it gives up some nice possibilities. In this case I went for a dry patina effect, choosing a light rust finish with lots of orange shades, starting first sprinkling some pale sand for getting some texture to the piece, followed by an orange wash. As this spare track section is so well detailed, I painted it in a more contrasted way than I used to work. Also, in some areas, I forced some color contrast to imitate deeper volumes, so every track link and teeth get highlighted in a different way. The exhaust cover was worked in a very similar way, using the same colors as the track links, but applying an enamel wash this time. The combination of the enamel wash and the pale sand chipped base enhances the feeling of a burnt and rusted metallic cover. Moving away from acrylics, now it's time for some oil weathering. In the last video I made some pre-dusting effects airbrushing Tamiya buff paint. Although this very first approach worked nicely, I wasn't really happy with it. Some of the dusty areas should be increased, and I think the model demands some dust streaking effects too. Using Naples Cielo Red mixed with some raw amber, I applied a heavy wash over the main corners of the vehicle. The application in this case needs to be controlled, as I don't want to lose the previous airbrushed effect. But in some specific areas I wasn't so restricted, as I really needed to push the dust effect. This light earth color works really well for creating light and dark contrast when you place it next to the Panzer grey elements. Once the old paint is dry to the touch, after 30 minutes or so, using an enamel thinner and a wet clean brush, I begin to remove partially the paint, or making some blending to get smoother results when needed. Working with oils allows me to get finer results than enamels, but you need to be subtle with the brush and avoiding hitting the surface too hard, otherwise you can remove the entire effect at once. Fuel stains are another interesting subject when it comes about dusted vehicles. Their behavior is way different here, as the fuel gets absorbed by the dust accumulated on the vehicle plates. A nice dust effect color variation is to use burnt amber to represent these dry fuel stain effects. Also, its reddish shade makes it very convenient for this task. For getting a complex texturing effect, I combined both speckling and direct brush applications. Again, using enamel thinner, I blend the edges of the stain effects with the light earth color, making softer transitions. At the same time, I correct the shape of each stain. By now, the fresh fuel effects will have to be delayed until pigment stage is finished. If not, pigment dust could easily damage their glossy finish. So after applying this whole bunch of effects, the upper hull is nearly finished. Usually I prefer to accomplish the running gear weathering first, as I often have a well-defined idea in my mind about how I want to paint the weathering scheme. Sadly, in this model I inverted the painting sequence. For representing some thicker earth accumulation on the suspension arms, I prepared a custom light matte concoction. Choosing acrylic gel as the medium makes the matte texture to be fast drying and it gets a nice volume. I also added a couple of color pigments for an earthy finish and some fine sand for achieving a nice matte texture. Depending how much you saturate the concoction, you can get a really thick matte. In this case, I added a higher proportion of pigment rather than sand, so the matte texture will be lighter. Weathering a desert tank doesn't mean you need to emit matte effects, but in most cases, they should be represented in a restricted way. In my case, I applied the matte texture in the lower areas and pieces of the running gear where real matte is harder to remove by wheels and trucks motion. Because it is an acrylic based matte texture, it means it dries fast, as I said before. Nevertheless, some corrections can be made using a stiff brush and water, blending the edges and correcting the shape. Once dry, the matte result is too rough to call it done, but results can be refined using enamel dust colors. Adding the light dust color through speckling is a good way of adding additional texture. At the same time, thicker matte gets blended with the rest of the elements in a more pleasant way. The Panzer II running gear can be perceived just partially from the outside. In this case, I didn't want to overdo the weathering and waste my time painting parts that won't be seen. So I decided to finish the process by adding a light sepia wash for a better definition of the main joints and most exposed pieces. Undertaking the wheels is one of my favorite processes. Preparing the different pieces and applying slightly different finishes makes every single wheel unique. First, and before we move to weathering, I base coated all the polished metal parts with Citadel Lead Vulture metallic color. When I applied earth effects to wheels, I always like to use 3 different earth colors. Usually a lighter earth color, a medium shade and a darker one. Following my usual technique, I first place the pigments in the wheels, focusing on the outer rim of each piece. Pigment amounts can be fixed in place later by adding some earth color washes, as the old paint binder will do the fixing work. If needed, some extra pigment amounts can be added when oil washes are still wet. Pigments are well known for being hard to control, and they really are. That's why I prefer to use them in very small quantities, to avoid any unpleasant results. Finally, I had to be careful for removing all the remnants of pigments from the rubber band, as shown in the real photos. One of my preferred techniques for contrasting wheels is to apply a sepia wash, working with diluted washes, and little by little adding definition to each piece is an ultimate effect in my opinion. The last effects to be applied are some lubricant leaks on the wheels, using burnt amber oil colors and wet effects for achieving a semi-gloss finish. In this particular case, I really cared about representing each wheel in a different way and creating different grades of leaking. You can see here the results once all the different effects, pigment and oils were applied. Moving now to trucks, these were primed with a mix of red, brown and black color from Tamiya. Back in the day, I used to apply a lot of different techniques when I painted trucks, but recently I optimized my workflow and I simplified my painting way. First, I apply an acrylic wash over the trucks, taking care of removing the excess of paint. An enamel wash would be more convenient for this task, but in terms of time management, it dries really quick, saving me some valuable time. Then I took the same earth pigment colors I used for the wheels. Using similar references creates more convincing effects for achieving balanced results, but also it feels more natural for the eye. Again, I spreaded the pigments using bigger amounts this time, and later they were fixed using light earth and sand oil color washes. Finally, I bring back all the metallic appearance by using a graphite pencil. Talking about graphite effects, this same metal looking appearance can be applied in other parts, such as the main weapons. In this case, I took a mechanical pencil to achieve extra accuracy, rubbing the tip around the main gun piece and paying attention to cover all the raised edges. For the main gun, and if you check historical photos, along the barrel there are some steel parts shinier than others. This is an easy effect to replicate by using masking tape and polishing the surface with more graphite. When finished, this would be a nice detail for adding more character to the model. For the shovel, I tried a new approach, as I was looking for a much weather finish. I made a first sketch drawing the more exposed areas by applying multiple graphite strokes, and later I blended these marks with enamel thinner and a stiff brush. Thinner ended up blending the graphite in a certain grade, and it created a nice transition between the metallic shine and the flat acrylic coat underneath. Finally, some standard polishing was applied to the model. Now just focusing on the lifting hooks, metal toolboxes, and the commander's hatch. I don't like to overdo this type of effects, but when they are properly represented, they add a very realistic looking to the plastic model. Do you remember the fuel stains effect we left in the standby? Going back to them, let's add some texture stained earth. I like these particular pigments for this type of effects. It has a slightly reddish shade, which makes it match with the hue of both burnt amber and bitumen oil colors. Now, following the same steps as for earth effects, I leave some pigment around the different caps. Then I applied a few oil washes using burnt amber and bitumen again, going from lighter to darker and restricting the wash surface each time. Finally, some black can be added to the bitumen color to increase the depth for the cap recesses. Here, for the engine deck access hatches, some different effects can be represented using the same colors as before, but now applied in a different way. I started applying a heavy speckling using bitumen color. Overlapping coats is a good way of achieving interesting and visually complex effects, but also there are some other useful techniques for representing oil stains, like using different colors for the same effect, or adding darker oil washes to imitate fresh oil marks. Last steps were focused on integrating all the small accessories. As I look for a realistic and consistent result, base coating every single small piece and then apply a pin wash is not enough. Sometimes it is necessary to apply some other effects, such as earth accumulations, a fresh oil effect for these fuel cans, or some light chipping effect similar to the one applied on the main vehicle. This is not about the result from a single detail part. Including different pieces of equipment following a feasible approach makes the model feel closer to the real vehicle. And if you search for historical references, desert tanks were full of different equipment. In my case, I like to glue small pieces in place using white glue. This might be not the quickest or the hardest glue out there, but it allows me to adjust every piece until it is correctly placed. And once dry, the bond is totally safe. So once all the small details are glued in place, we can call this tiny boy finished. Honestly, I'm very happy about how this model turned out. In my case, I find it really hard to represent the realistic desert weathering, specifically when you pretend to add dust effects over a dust color model. I think the addition of all those small weathering steps is what brings balance to the final result, achieving a soft dust weathering over a weathered sand color camouflage, but also with some nice detail effect around the vehicle. Finally, increasing the definition, adding detail washes brings all together, highlighting every single part of the model. After completing this project, and for all of you watching this video, stay tuned as I plan to upload fresh content really soon. As always, I hope you found this video useful or interesting. So thanks for watching and I see you in the next one.